a lot of us felt that we had a mission. That was like the old mission from God thing. That this was the right work to be doing, that it was important to humanity to have this information and to be able to access the whatever that other parts of your brain are that you can find when you're high.
Welcome to the Set and Setting podcast with Madison Margolin. As a journalist, Madison has spent years exploring the intersection of psychedelics, cannabis, and culture. This podcast brings together thought leaders from today's psychedelic renaissance to talk about the role of psychedelics in our inner and outer lives. You can support this podcast and find additional resources at BeHereNowNetwork.com/Madison.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Set and Setting. We have with us today Carolyn Garcia, also known as Mountain Girl. Maybe you recognize the name from the electric Kool-Aid acid test. She spent a lot of time, or was one of the Merry Pranksters, and was one of the pranksters, I guess you could say, and also with the Grateful Dead, and is now, in the decades since, has gone on to do a lot of different things that I want to get into. So, Carolyn, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Well, thank you for asking. It's a delight to meet you, Madison.
Yeah, I think we first met at the Bicycle Day conference last year, correct?
That's right, which was a wonderfully crazy and fun event.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, Bicycle Day is kind of like the 420 of LSD. 4/19, April 19th is the day that Albert Hofmann intentionally ingested LSD for the first time. And so that was the day of the first official intentional acid trip. Did you know, I'm curious actually with regard to the legacy of Bicycle Day, today with the whole psychedelic renaissance, so to speak, I think a lot of people know what it is, but back when you first started getting into psychedelics, were you familiar with that history and legacy of it?
I think that my advance into the world of psychedelics was kind of accidental. The first job that I had away from home was running the mass spectrometer at Carl Gerassi's lab at Stanford. And it was like, I was 17. And I was kind of a whiz, but it was a little bit beyond my skill set. So it took a while to get used to work. And I had the night shift too, which was actually crazy to give a 17-year-old girl the night shift at the spectrometer lab at Stanford. But I could do it. I had a science background, and I was able to, run with that. Plus, I could read and spell the chemical names. This was all organic chemistry. And I was down in the basement, and where I had the place to myself at night, and I was on the night shift, which was also pretty strange. But meanwhile, upstairs in the organic chemistry labs themselves, there was always a raging party going on every night that would run until about 4 a.m. So I never lacked for comfort and amusement. If I could, all I had to do was run up the stairs for 5 minutes, and there was people. But it was a lonely job.
Mm-hmm.
It had its pitfalls also.
So what were your first couple of experiences with psychedelics like?
Oh, with psychedelics, first I had an interest. Life magazine did a big issue back when I was a teenager about Leary and Albert and psychedelics and LSD. And my parents, of course, had a subscription to that, and I read it carefully. And because we were a science family, I understood most of the terms, and I realized that, here somebody has developed a drug that might help you see either into the future or into yourself in a more deliberate and focused way than we have normally. So I was already interested, but it was not for a while that I ever had any. But being at Stanford, which was totally, sometimes you say you see, how did I get there? Well, it was just all happenstance. I applied for a job at Stanford. This was the one they gave me. And so chemistry was flowing over my desk, and I had to do these samples, and I had to do I had to run these samples through the mass spectrometer, about 20 of them a night, to keep up with the flow from the lab upstairs. And people were sending in organic chemical compounds from around the world. And I had to, do all the writing of what the mass spectrometer said about what the actual spectrograph would give you, and make a copy of that, and then carefully label and put it away. So it was really nitpicky job, and I don't think I did that good a job at that age. But it was very, very interesting, and I was kind of operating above my real level.
Mm-hmm. So what, again, I could say I first met you as a character in this book, right? In the electrolyte acid test.
Yes.
So how did you get from the science family at Stanford to, onto the bus, so to speak, with the Merry Pranksters?
The issue that got me fired from Stanford was, I think, the sample of ibogaine that came across my desk. And my boss had told me to be really careful with this one. It was from a researcher in Africa. This was, it's in a little tube. And so I tasted it, and it knocked my socks off. So I eventually ran the sample, but from that moment forward, I had a little problem with that gigantic machine that I was running. And it was no longer my friend. It became, the whole thing kind of turned alien on me. And I began to pull back from the skill set that I had. So pretty soon, not too much long after that mistake, I would say, as a teenager, they fired me, and I had to retreat. But I had gotten very, very high. And the machine, the mass spectrometer, which was this huge thing that took up, like a quarter acre of the basement on the chemistry building, the organic chemistry building for sure, it became alien, and it was not easy anymore, and it was scary. And I had changed, and my fault. And I lost my concentration. So I got fired. And then about 6 months later, after knocking around Palo Alto for a while, I had a boyfriend. We had a good time, and he had to go back to his roots in the Midwest when he graduated. So I was feeling around for friends and feeling kind of bad because he left. And I met one of the Merry Pranksters at the coffee shop. And it was Neil Cassidy, who I guess I had heard about him. He was a pretty far out there guy, and he had a couple of friends with him, and they were the only people there. So we fell into a conversation, and they said, "Hey, do you want to go for a ride? We'll go for a ride." And they took me to Ken Kesey's house, and I met the Merry Pranksters, and they immediately just swept me up. And then I had friends and a place to stay. So it kind of solved all my problems at once. Wow. And I had a friendship group that I would have for the rest of my life. It was almost like a magic journey.
Wow.
It took me out of the lab, into the world, and then into the people that I would be associating with for life.
Wow. It's funny because, I'm in the middle of writing a book right now, kind of like a journalistic memoir, a little, not quite like the electrolyte acid test, mm-hmm. but there's all sorts of characters who, once people read my book might, being like, oh, I know you from this book. So it's funny how Wonderful. That's how I know of you. But I remember meeting, I think through sort of like psychedelic consciousness, when you come into your crew of people who've sort of tuned into the same into like that same channel, you just know, right? And I have this whole chapter called Soul Family, which I think sounds similar to what you're describing when you kind of first fell in with the pranksters, and it sounds like it just clicked for you.
It did, and they they quickly introduced me to LSD in a very tiny way, and then and I realized that I can manage this. And my experiences, my personal balance was good enough that I could get high and not lose myself. Mm-hmm. So that was really fun, but this was a very unusual bunch of people. So it was a little bit daunting at first, and of course, then by getting fired from my job at Stanford, I didn't have any money, so I wound up sleeping in a tree in my sleeping bag. And it was summer, so it was fine. Mm-hmm. And I had a wonderful time with them. So it was my LSD family, as we would call it now.
Wow.
And a lot of what we did was hide from police action, of which there was plenty, and create atmospheric parties for various groups of people. One of the best parties we had was for the poets. And my friend Ken Kesey had all their names and addresses, so he invited them. And they showed up from all over the country, all the beat poets, basically. And it was so fun, to be able to have a place out in the forest that was safe and absolutely beautiful, old house and huge trees with a creek running by. And it was just sort of the perfect place to introduce people to a small dose of psychedelics. And we rarely had a problem with some folks having a negative trip. Once in a great while, someone would be sort of allergic to an altered state and would require some babysitting. But for the most part, by using a small dose, you could introduce people to lysergic acid and help them into the other universe. And mostly they loved it. So it felt like we were doing some good work.
What was considered a small dose at that point?
Oh, it's like 75 mics.
Okay, just
100 mics is pretty much of a full dose in those days. Mm-hmm. And of course, this was Sandoz LSD, so it was very good. It was pure, and somehow it had arrived. I don't know where it came from exactly, mm-hmm. but it was definitely in the little Sandoz glass capsules.
So with the way people are talking about psychedelics today, as these healing medicines, and obviously you could take a psychedelic for any sort of reason, but back then I'm curious, did people see it or talk about it as something medicinal or therapeutic, or what was the perception of what acid was about?
I think the perception was that the altered state was the visionary state, was the one that we were kind of going for at that time, and sort of the enlivening of your human carcass, which normally we just sort of walk around with our feet on the ground, not thinking about our lower limbs or what our body's doing, but it put you in touch with yourself in this very intimate fashion. And so, running up and down the paths in the woods became, magical, and just you could feel the elevation and it puts you in touch with yourself in such a special way. You become more you, which is kind of hard to describe, but it's a real thing. And it felt really, really good. I was young and frisky and just couldn't. It was an energizer that I felt like I had been waiting for. Mm-hmm. But it takes you to the next step of being inside your body and yet connecting to the universe in that very special way that psychedelics can do for you. So, as a teenager, I was just leaping. I was leaping up and down these hills, and I just was having a great time.
And was there, it sounds like an inherently spiritual experience.
Yes.
Were people talking about it like that, and how were they framing it with regard to spirituality?
With this group, wasn't particularly notably spiritual. I think it was energizing, illuminating, and conversation provoking. And Ken Kesey, being at that time a hot author, had the skill of calling people in to come and partake. And so he started to have carefully planned parties. And he had the best party he had was the poets' party. And so he reached out to all the beat poets who were around the country. And by golly, they came. We really rounded them all up. And they just had the best time. They thought it was fantastic. And these are folks who, spent a life drinking alcohol and not really thinking about the other realms of possibility. So it was an absolute delight to make this available to people who were committed, creative minds who actually worked in the creative realm. And that seemed to be the most successful uses for LSD was in bringing people to the point of understanding their creativity.
Mm-hmm. And, another thing I want to kind of understand better is that, again, it's so interesting how much the psychedelic discourse has changed or evolved. And, especially what's so popular today is ceremony culture and ayahuasca and these very intentional, curated settings. And, the parties that the pranksters were part of sound like they were curated and had intentions behind them. But there's also a rascal element that I think personally, I sometimes joke, and I mean it with no disrespect, that I get this ceremony fatigue. Not everything has to be so serious. And I think in the lightheartedness of a party, there's a lot of therapy that happens. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think one of the problems with ceremony is that people don't talk to each other. And, the sitting in a circle isn't necessarily a communications game, So we played other kinds of games. And really, I think interpersonal connection seemed very important. And so we did not have a religious practice or any of that going for us at all. Quite the contrary. It was much more about fun and frolic and letting loose and, and having deep conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And then the part of connection between people, which often is kind of stilted. Back in the 60s, we weren't really sure how to get along with people we hadn't met yet, and it's like a new relationship. That a little LSD kind of wipes away the difficulty of engaging with people. And so these were, I think, intimate in reality. We had an intimate reality that we shared with each other, which was sort of unspoken and really nice. And it worked. It all worked to bring people together.
What about for the people who, tend to get anxious on acid or stuck in their head or socially overwhelmed and overstimulated?
Right. Those ones, you could take them into the kitchen, and give them something to eat. Usually it's food, their blood pressure or blood sugar has dropped. So that's when you have to give them a piece of pumpkin pie or something at that point. And chat them up. And that seemed to help. I did a lot of that, trying to read people. And you could see people withdrawing, when they would withdraw into themselves and back out of the circle. And so we usually had a couple of folks who were watching for that and would lead them into there and get some calories, because it's usually calories is the problem. But keep them away from the beer, because beer People kept bringing beer, and we'd have to hide it.
Was set and setting a term that was in use at that point?
We'd heard the term, but it wasn't something we really operated from. But we did try to make it nice, pillows on the floor. We were in this incredible grove of redwood trees with a babbling creek alongside. And then, of course, there was like 3 cop cars parked out there on the road, just in case you were thinking about leaving. Nobody ever left. But, it attracted quite a bit of the wrong kind of attention as well. Because this was early, right? It was early on. And our host, Ken Kesey, had worked at the mental hospital at Stanford. And so while he was working there, he observed that the previous doctors that had been there had left quite a trove of psychedelics in the storage room, and he helped himself to some of that, and that kind of ran the program for a while until new people came up that were actually making LSD. Mm-hmm. But I found LSD to be wonderfully enlightening and energizing, and I could be a good hostess, and I could take care of people without getting tired as the night wore on. And then, at a certain point, everybody would go to sleep at about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. It would all come to an end, and the quiet would descend, and it was just lovely. It was a lovely thing to do for people.
Wow. So, I have so much FOMO for this time that I wasn't alive for yet. But, yeah. It reminds me, I have a friend who has this phrase, hippies hate to leave. But it sounds like in your case, they couldn't leave because the cops were right outside.
Exactly. No, we didn't. We tried to keep people from leaving. It wasn't such a good idea. Some did anyway.
Yeah.
But it was, we were down in the forest, and it was a safe place. It really was.
Well, it also encourages sort of this more communal atmosphere, I think, like with the whole thrust toward, communal living, and then, eventually people going on and doing Back to the Land movement and rainbow gatherings. So how did that culture feed the other?
Well, I think what you're talking about is trust, is that even though we didn't know each other very well, somehow trust was able to emerge in the psychedelic ceremony or consumption, in the circle, I would call it. We learned to trust each other very quickly, and it seemed like a trust that would last forever. Somehow we knew each other through the gift of the LSD to see into each other's active brain and personality. So that was a wonderful thing, because instead of not knowing people very well, you felt like you innately knew them, or that you could read their aura. So all of this stuff was like new information. Nobody had heard of an aura until sometime into the middle of all of this. So it was interesting, the collision between Eastern thought and Western wildness. Mm-hmm. It made for a very active and busy group.
So you said you knew Ram Dass. So how did he kind of engage with the scene, or what was your experience of him?
Okay, so first, I'm from Poughkeepsie, New York. So Poughkeepsie is right around the corner from Millbrook. And when I had to go home to upstate New York, I immediately borrowed my mother's car and drove over to Millbrook and met those guys. I just drove in, and first I met Ralph Metzner, who must not be forgotten, because he was the gatekeeper to Leary and Ram Dass. He answered the door, and I knocked, and he himself was a quiet, thoughtful, very intelligent man, And I really liked it. I felt like meeting Leary. He was too busy with his cascade of lawsuits, dealing with the law, because he'd already been had a really difficult situation there. Richard Albert was quite delightful and loved to go on walks around the property at Millbrook, which is a beautiful place. And so he and I went out for a long walk and talked. And I shared what I knew, which wasn't very much yet. But believe me, I was completely stunned, because this was only 15 miles from where I grew up in upstate New York. And to have these amazing people land outside of Poughkeepsie, and where I could just drive up and meet them, was absolutely wonderful. And in school and stuff, I'd been kind of a loner, because I had this natural science background that was really intense. Both my parents are naturalists, and my dad was an entomologist for the state of New York, and my mother had a botany degree and did a lot of botanical drawing. So they were all about plants and insects. So I had this strong science background already, but just to have that experience and then be talking to people who are just coming on to LSD for the first time about plants and insects, I always had something to say. Like, look at this, and here is that, and look, a praying mantis, or a snail. And it was so fun for me to bring people into the psychedelic sphere. I thought it was a great privilege.
What there's that whole scene, I think, the meeting of like the East and West with with Leary's very like staid Millbrook vibe. And then when the pranksters came, like how was that contrast really received at that point?
I think by that time, Leary had already run into so much trouble with the law that they were really, really after him. Unfortunately, this sort of presaged what happened to us too, because eventually that scrutiny washed over onto us, but not in such a ferocious way. They really went after Leary. They wanted him to commit suicide, I'm pretty sure. But he had so much grace and charm. He was a very stable personality. He didn't get agitated. And every time I ever saw him or met him, he radiated calm and intelligence. And so I felt like he was in a terrible pickle, but he handled himself with so much grace. It was hard to tell that he was having paranoid fits, which he must have had. It was a very difficult situation for him because he was out there. He was very visible.
Wow. Yeah, I've heard a good deal about Leary and his legal issues. My dad was his lawyer when he escaped from prison.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Well, then you know the story.
A little bit. I think he had way more legal issues than my dad actually helped him with, like beyond just that one case.
Right. But he impressed me both with he was kind of fidgety, I would say. Leary was always kind of glancing over his shoulder by the time I met him. But Richard Albert was the soul of calm, and he was transitioning to Ram Dass at the time. I think right after I met him, but he was still Dr. Albert at that point. But he was, tall and gracious and very kind. And Ralph Metzner also, just a lovely person. So these were angelically inspired people. They wanted to share. They wanted to bring everybody who was interested into the sphere and help them, reach a higher level. And it was completely clear to me that they were angelically inspired. They were doing this for the good of humanity.
Was their approach to acid, how was their approach to acid different from the prankster approach? Because it's
Well, I didn't really know. I think they were more careful than we were, and they had more experience, longer experience. And so we didn't really incorporate them. It was too difficult already to incorporate them into our scene. So we remained sort of the outlaw gang, because we really were. We one of the things that the pranksters did was invite the Hells Angels to come from Oakland and wherever, all the many places they came from, and turn them on. And that was an amazing party. They were very nice. They were very grateful, So it seemed like that was our job, was to reach to the outliers and help them come into the circle.
It also feels, and I want to talk about the acid tests and like what is the ethos of the acid test in general and the graduation. And, I know this was part of the, part of the parties, but the way we use the terms today in the discourse, I have a friend, he wrote a book on cannabis, and he often would say, oh, such and such was the acid test for, if religion can make you free or something like that. So what do we mean when we talk about this?
Okay, so the original meaning for acid test had something to do with chemistry. And you could test chemicals with an acid bath of, or whatever, or to see if gold was really gold. I think that was where it came from. But it just, Ken Kesey was a wordsmith, and he thought that was it was lysergic acid, and it soon got dubbed acid. And because lysergic was a word that escaped people's spelling monitor, they couldn't quite figure it out. And so that was an easier way to say it, but I never liked that term. I thought it was a little rough. But it just, it was an easy way to talk about it. And I think sharing it was, it was sort of the golden rule, that it was so good. Plus, this was mostly Sandoz that we had. And I'm not sure what the source was. I don't know too much about that, but it was not made by chemists in the U.S. It was definitely an import. And when we ran out of Sandoz acid and had to use LSD that was made locally, there was a big difference there. I think Sandoz had a lock on really high quality stuff. Just to put that in there. It was, we had a friend called that we called, I don't know his real name. We called him the Mad Chemist, and he made a batch for us. And it just wasn't that good. It was edgy and made you nervous and want to brush your teeth a lot or something. It was physically uncomfortable. And so we figured that had to be because it wasn't made in a good lab. So having a good product is really important. And when we ran out of Sandoz, I think a lot of things kind of collapsed at that point because we couldn't get the good stuff. And I don't know too much more about that story or where it's at right now.
So for the acid tests, though, like for the parties, like what, when we're talking about like as a metaphor, really, like what are we referring to, when you, yeah.
So basically what we would do we went on to do bigger parties and public parties called acid tests. And we did quite a few acid tests around in taking our income, taking our whole personalities and putting it on the firing line in public. So we would mix up a batch of LSD in actually a new garbage can full of Kool-Aid. So that became the electric Kool-Aid that Tom Wolfe wrote about. And that was the easiest way because you could make it pretty dilute. So it was not strong. It was a real light. If you drank a little 8-ounce cup full, you would get like maybe 40 micrograms at the most. And so it would come on in a much more slow and genteel fashion. And that worked well. for people just coming in off the street, we charged $1 for this service. Which didn't really cover the cost of renting a facility, but it made it work. And then we hired a band. There was this really cool band that wanted to come and work with us, and they were the Warlocks, but then they renamed themselves the Grateful Dead for some reason, which we thought was pretty strange. And so they insisted on playing in every single one of our things. They loved it. And they would partake and get pretty high and play and do these long, rambling sets, where they just play, and it wasn't really any song particularly. They were just playing. And I wish we had more tapes of that stuff. But a lot of those tapes, those special tapes, got lost over the years, or they fell apart or whatever. But they would play for about 2 hours, and then stop. And so we'd put some music on, and they'd go refresh themselves, and then come back and play for another 2 hours. So it was like they were very high too, and we made friendships that have lasted to this day. What wonderful people, and what a wonderful place Palo Alto was to create this community. There's friends that we still have. A lot of people are gone now, but I feel like the second and third generations are coming along. But that's different now. It's like when you come into a family history of using LSD, I think as a young person, it's a little daunting. So I don't think that it's negatively affected the second and third generations, particularly. The offspring can choose whether they want to or not, and for the most part, they have chosen to try it and then back off.
Why do you think that is?
Just because. Why would you want to do what your parents do, right? So we were the weirdos, and they were trying to live in modern society, because we had already established ourselves as pretty odd ducks.
So Ken Kesey also talked about like this notion of going further, right? Like not necessarily going through the revolving door of just, taking acid and whatever, but like what is it actually to take acid, and then what, right? Like what do you actually do with the consciousness once you've integrated it into yourself, and how do you see that playing out post Pranksters, or, in your life?
And that is a very big question. And I think that it's very individualized. It's my belief that all of us that were doing the production of these events developed special sensitivities that we could just look at somebody and see kind of where they were, and either bring help or bring them a glass of water, or whatever that thing is that's needed. It was like a special sense of what was going on with somebody in an hour into their first LSD trip, and you could kind of read their physical profile. I mean, I wouldn't call it telepathy, but seemed like some of that was going on. Like we kind of knew who was having a safe journey and who was struggling. And yes, we did have some folks who fled the scene occasionally, but for the most part, it went really well. But the thing is, here we are in Palo Alto, Stanford University, which was like where this all came from. A lot of people who had either medical or technical training of one kind or another, a lot of graduate students. So it was a fairly intellectual crowd. And Ken Kesey himself invited specific people to come. And one time we had the poets party. He invited all the beat poets from around the country. And we got up some money, too, to be able to bring people from New York and so on. So it was Allen Ginsberg, and it was a really, really interesting time. Apparently the poets were older. They weren't, the flowing, smart youth of Stanford, but they were older men often, and women. And they were a little averse to LSD. They didn't like it that much. It put them off their game, I guess. And so somehow it was important to Mr. Kesey to share, but I don't think the poets were that happy with it. they had their own work going on in their own heads and didn't need any new input. That's what one of them said to me. Is, I don't know what to do with all this input. So it was, different people enjoyed it more than others. Yeah. And I feel like the outliers enjoyed it the most. It really was true. Yeah.
So, I guess, again, with regard to what do you do now, right? Like acid has sort of changed your consciousness. Any person, not just you specifically, but once someone has had enough experiences with a psychedelic, Ram Dass's answer was, okay, how can I sustain this in a spiritual practice? So how have you seen, again, this relationship to psychedelics changing people afterward, whether through spirituality or creativity or what have you?
I think that the increase in both the sense of spirit, that there's an overwhelming, what you would call it, a glow of spirituality around all humans. It has to do with our brains and our personal sensitivities. But I feel like that a lot of the early understanding of this stuff has kind of washed down in a way that it's not really thought about that much before. It concerns me when I think that LSD's become more of a party drug for some people, but it certainly is a mood elevator. So it has its very extremely practical uses, but at the same time for introspection or for doing writing or coming up with big ideas, it still can't be beat. I think it's still a valuable tool. And, but it can certainly be, we had to deal with a few overdoses. That's easy to do. People think, well, if a little's good, a lot must be great. And it isn't. It's difficult. So we've always told people to go low. Don't try to overdo it. And you want to take care of yourself first. And I think that works better than trying to be a show off or take a giant leap of spirit. Those things are, you don't know where you're going to end up. Mm-hmm. And so it's not exactly something to keep you mentally balanced, but it can lead you to that.
Is there a concept of, with regard to the graduation, so to speak, like getting over it, using moving it and moving past it? Yeah.
I think it was 50% moving into your new reality, your augmented self, and part of it was a present to the cops who were trying to of course crush us and make it sound like we were telling people to, okay, now you're done. You don't have to do this anymore. It was a little bit of a subterfuge at the same time. So that was Ken Kesey's invention, to do the acid test graduation. And it was kind of fun. The Grateful Dead played. We had a wonderful party. And then we stopped doing the acid tests at that point. It was getting too dangerous. We were, Ken had to go do a few years in jail. And, they really wanted to shut him down completely. And he managed, with the help of a really good attorney, stay out of the big house for most of the rest of his life. So he was always under fire, however, and always felt the breath, behind him of the interest from the police. But so he moved up to Oregon and had bought a farm and had a quieter life and raised his family. And we all saw a lot of him over the years.
So, I actually wanted to get to that. You're up in Oregon now still, right?
Yes.
So what, I know you've done a lot since kind of this 60s, 70s moment. So you want to talk about where you're at now and how, that launched you into your current future self?
Well, my current future self is aging, and I have to, count how many of my friends are still around. But it seems like there hasn't been any loss of longevity from getting high. We're all headed into our 80s. I'm not there yet, but I will be soon. I was sort of one of the youngest persons at the acid test. I was 17, 18 when I was doing that, and now I'm in my late 70s and healthy, seemingly pretty alert. So I don't think it hurt me too much, but I'm cautious now. And I don't feel like I want to get high when I don't know that I'm about to. So I'm cautious at shows, and it's like, how do you manage yourself? And how much time do you have to spend time managing yourself if you're uncomfortable, or if you've gotten dosed, and all of those considerations, which are always things you had to take into consideration at Grateful Dead shows. When I got married to Jerry and became Mrs. Garcia, and we had kids and stuff like that, then we had to be really careful, because we couldn't really have events at our house, or basically the shows were where things happened, and we no longer took any responsibility or action as far as helping people get high. Basically, the music became the high, and people had to take care of their own needs. So that was a much safer position to be in. We didn't, because being a prankster and being so out there was, it was like standing on the edge of a diving board a lot. You did not know when you were going to get knocked into the pool, and because we were taking such an extreme stance for the 1960s, and but we also, a lot of us felt that we had a mission. That was like the old mission from God thing. That this was the right work to be doing, that it was important to humanity to have this information and to be able to access the whatever that other parts of your brain are that you can find when you're high.
So how did your mission evolve once you were with Jerry?
Well, I started having children, so that took it up. That you can't do both, and so there was a long period of motherhood for me, and which hasn't ended really. It's still going on, but I never lost my ability to take a small dose at an event or a show, and still what we call maintain. You could still maintain yourself. You could not, fall completely apart or go too far. And that was enough for me for a long time. And I feel like as I've gotten older, I'm much more cautious about my dosage, and treat myself as carefully as I can. Mm-hmm. The one thing I always worry about is if you're high, you might step in a hole and break your leg, because I've done that. And you don't want to do that. So it's like that whole thing of maintaining your ability to function was always really important to me. Even as a prankster back in the days, I was the tech. I had to set up all the the lights and the sound, and I was constantly working the tape machines and all this stuff. And sometimes if you take a little bit too much, all of that stuff becomes a colossal, difficult task, to focus on. To focus on machinery and keeping things plugged in and everything running right. So I did a lot of that, and I know I'm capable of it. But really, what I wanted to do was to retreat into the forest and write poetry. That was much more what I really wanted to do, and I didn't get a lot of chances to do that. And so now I get which is great. I could be as thoughtful and philosophical as I want to be. And I'm not holding up anybody.
Mm.
I've released myself from the active phase.
And how did all of that get you into cannabis in a different way?
Oh, cannabis came with the territory, because cannabis was already wildly popular in California when I landed there at age 17. So, my first boyfriend turned me on immediately, and I thought it was great stuff, and made me happy, and it didn't interfere with my functioning very much, and it gave a giggle, where there hadn't been so many laughs before that. So I found cannabis really amusing, and but as time went by, it got a lot stronger, and so you had to really moderate what you're going to do there, because the cannabis of today is nothing like what we used to get. It's much stronger and much better grown. And I grew a lot of cannabis myself and wrote a book about it.
Right, I have your book.
Yeah, and so The Primal Plant was the name of my book, and it was a good thing that I did that. It was like the second book written about growing cannabis, and it was basically just a primer on organic gardening, is what it was. Secretly, this is an organic gardening book, and and it sold a lot of copies. I still sell these, and I'm proud of it. It's still right on. And even with all the science and study of cannabis, I realized I was good. Well, my dad was an agricultural extension agent. My mom was a botanist. I had the perfect combination. I had all this information at my fingertips. It was easy. It was easy to write that book.
Going back a little bit, it sounds like, when you married Jerry and you started, you were having more kids and, kind of transitioning into like a mother. I mean, you already transitioning more into a family role. You were already a mother, right? Yeah. So how did, I'm just kind of curious, you hear about all these stories of women, in the psychedelic space, kind of even behind the scenes. I've interviewed Roni Stanley before as well. So how did women balance those, the scenes, really, like the scene out in the parties and also at home with the kids? And how did that also inform your parenting, where the parents are so engaged in psychedelics?
Well, luckily, the thing about psychedelics is they wear off after 8 hours. You can go home and be relatively normal, and no one knows what you just did. So if they didn't wear off, it would be different. But obviously the long-term effects change your programming somewhat. But I feel like I was a good parent. I had 3 daughters. They all seem to be healthy and cogent, and they will occasionally be interested in psychedelics too. But we're sort of we've backed off from overt, and we're not busy with that anymore. I feel like the whole psychedelic revolution metastasized to the point where everybody can get whatever they wanted and have that same experience that we had of creating a communal feeling with your friends. We could do things together. We can decide on things together and sit in a circle and have meetings. And it was so sort of deliberate. Getting high together became a bit of a ritual. It worked for interpersonal communication very, very well. Every once in a while, we would have someone come in who didn't handle it well, and they required special attention, and we would try to give it. Didn't always work, doesn't always work for everybody. And so that's, there are caveats that go with this. It's not for everybody. And one who has a history of mental illness probably should stay away from psychedelics in general. It doesn't seem to be a curative for mental illness at all. And I think that the Ken Kesey's first book, which was basically about people being treated for mental illness, was seminal to this whole thing. That put him in touch with that whole the mindset of psychology and psychiatry when he was working as an orderly at Stanford Hospital. When he was going to Stanford, that was his job, and it's kind of how the whole thing got started. But it's like a sacred duty to look after each other, and none of us really had trouble with taking on that sacred duty. And it's certainly something that you've got to take it seriously from the heart. Otherwise, you're going to balance yourself into some other way of being. I think being open to people is a practice and a gift, and being able to see into what's going on with someone is definitely a practice that you can work on. And psychedelics help with that.
So one of my closing questions is how have psychedelics influenced your own kind of spiritual practice, or where are you at now with spirituality?
I'm a student of nature. This planet is somehow blessed with amazing life. We are a product of that life. I don't know why life has evolved to have all this memory and language and songs, and speaking as in my human condition, but as part of all life. What a magical thing! Show me someplace else that has this stuff. We don't know that there is one. We don't know if there's another planet with life on it. Hard to know right now. We're sort of stuck in our own little corner of the galaxy. We're guessing about what else the universe holds and what other forms of life there might be. But there's certainly been a lot of UFO sightings, but we haven't really settled down for a nice chat. So about that. So we don't really know what the human race is going to be in the future. And I think it's a great thing to think about. Mm-hmm. The possibilities are so huge. Look at what we've already done with brains and an ability to rob the minerals of the earth and the fish from the sea, and gather everything together to make it to feed people, to make spaceships. My goodness, where are we going? It's really a good question, something to think about. I love science fiction myself. I really, really appreciate science fiction writers for all that they can create in their minds and share. I think it's really valuable stuff.
So, yeah, I think a lot of people who are interested in psychedelics also get interested in outer space and science fiction just because you're, realize how much we don't know.
And it's when possibilities turn into probabilities that we get engaged. It's like, suddenly the opportunity appeared to go to the moon. Wowie. And, it happens. So, we're really looking at the universe from not just a point in a place in space, but also for all the possibilities that are out there. Whether any of this is going to manifest, I don't know. Mm-hmm. But it started to.
So what advice would you give to anyone, from sort of today's psychedelic renaissance, or anyone looking to incorporate it into their lives or glean something from it? What do you want to impart?
I think the most important thing is to honor your friendships. Don't get so far out that you start losing your friends. That's the most important thing, is to stay in relativity with your dear friends, because that's the best support you'll ever get in life. And be cautious.
Yeah.
Madison, I think you know about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything else I didn't ask you that you want to talk about or add?
I want to talk about, partly I'd just like to mention my mom and dad, who kind of led me down this path without knowing they were doing it, because they were both scientists. My mom was raised in India by botanists, And my father was a Canadian entomologist. So from an early age, I was constantly hearing Latin phrases in my ear and observing the wing structure of damselflies and the pollen sacs on various kinds of flowers. All of this stuff was being presented to us. And I think to have a natural science curriculum in your life is really important. Everybody needs to learn about the amazing variety of life on this planet, because it's incredible. It's incredible what life has already done and made. That we're surrounded by living things, each of which has its unique character. Oh, it's absolutely astounding if you look at it from the point of view of somebody who was perhaps grew up on the moon, where there's none of this. That life itself is probably the most important thing and the most interesting thing we've got to look at.
I like that as a takeaway. I often think that, once you've kind of tuned into the psychedelic consciousness, that you see that actually the mundane stuff is equally psychedelic as
you see the mundane is just as miraculous as anything else.
Exactly.
The whole thing is a miracle.
Exactly.
And how life continues to promote itself and reproduce and change, and it's a giant force, and we still don't understand it very well. Where did it come from?
Right. I think we end up with more questions than answers when we start asking for answers.
Which is delightful. We love questions.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for joining the podcast. And if anyone in the audience wants to learn more about your work or follow along, is there anywhere they can get that information?
I don't know. It's just, I'm just kind of out here. I do sell my book about how to grow weed, which I'm still proud of and is still right on. But it's I'm getting older. I'm 77, and I don't go out in public too much. Now and then. And if you see me out there, yeah, you can talk to me. I'm ready.
All right, great. Well, thank you for talking to me. It's an honor to learn from you, and really, again, I look up so much to your generation and what the stage that has been set by all the psychedelic elders.
Well, thank you, Madison.
Yeah.
That means a lot to me. Glad you're not mad at us and throwing rocks, because some people would.
No, not at all.
Change things,
not at all.
Really did. So, thanks a lot. Thanks for that compliment.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.